It is around the early 19th century in the United States. Slavery has been around in America since 1619. When a Dutch ship called the Treasurer sailed through Chesapeake Bay up to the James River to a settlement known as Jamestown, it carried a ship filled with slaves. Having slaves to do your work was convenient. It was easygoing for the Caucasians, but the slaves were never asked how they felt because the slave owners either didn't care or couldn't understand the African language. Every year, thousands and thousands of slaves were brought from Africa to come to America to work for life. In the southern states, slavery was very popular compared to the north. It was thought that bringing people who spoke a different language and had a different culture could adapt to American customs and the English language as well as Christianity. Soon it turned from something based on money into something based on race. Originally, the North stopped using slaves because it did not work within their communities. Although the majority of the people in the North believed holding slaves was wrong, many people in the North were still pro-slavery. Women, men, and children were forced to work on plantations to farm crops, work in houses, and work as servants. Every day, slaves were forced to do the same back-breaking work over and over for the rest of their lives. If you were lucky and your master favored you, you could have had chances to move to different cities or states and you become a house slave. Becoming a house slave was much better than that of a field slave. A house slave was dressed how any human should be dressed. They get to bathe any time they liked. They were fed and they were given a nice place to sleep. Obviously, being a slave in general was bad, whether or not you were working in a house or a field, but as a house slave, you were given many more opportunities. Regardless of your circumstances, if you were to try and talk back to your owner, you could have the chance of getting whipped, slapped, shot, or if you were a woman, even raped.
This whole process wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the abolitionists involved. Some of the main abolitionists were Harriet Tubman, Isaac Hopper, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, William Still, and many others. Many of the conductors in the Underground Railroad would put up quotes which had secret meanings for runaway slaves. Another main advocate was Abraham Lincoln. His main phrase was, "Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him." As the president, he had a larger advantage and tried to spread freedom throughout the United States. William Lloyd Garrison was another person who helped change the views on slaves. He would write newspapers every day trying to spread the words of freedom. In one of his papers, he said, "I am determined to lift up the standard of freedom in the eyes of the nation. Within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty, my standard is now unfurled, and long may it float till every bondman be set free." Other people were also a main part of the emancipation of slaves. People such as Theodore Parker, who was referred to as the Great American Preacher. He preached many sermons and advocated for many nights. Parker also put up signs for the slaves. One read, "Caution, colored people of Boston, kidnappers and slave catchers. People of Boston, rally to freedom." One main abolitionist was John Brown. He tried to create a revolt against Confederates, hoping the slaves would help. When none of them came to help, he was stuck fighting off those men by himself, which caused him to later die. Although Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist as well, he didn't always agree with the Underground Railroad and had many judgments. In his narrative, he wrote, "I have never approved of the very public manner in which some of our Western friends have conducted what they call the Underground Railroad." He later writes, most emphatically, the Upperground Railroad. He thought that the Underground Railroad was too popularized, which was why it was harder for those slaves to escape. Slaves had gone through so much pain, an unimaginable amount now, that the abolitionists created the Underground Railroad in hopes to bring all slaves to freedom.
Abolitionists set up safe houses, routes, and had what they called conductors working to lead slaves into their free states. Slaves would sneak out at night or during the day to designated areas where someone would come get them and bring them to only a small part of their very long journey. Slaves would be brought through the woods by the North Star, which helped keep an eye on steps, as well as keeping a vast eye out for tree moss, which indicated their north and south poles, since moss only grows on the north side of trees. Slaves would also be brought into secret compartments of houses until the conductors were ready to set them out for freedom again. Conductors would take slaves among boats, tell them to keep quiet and stay down, and then deliver them to other conductors until they were free. Some were so exhausted from their journeys that they would take their own lives just to end suffering. Their journeys took days and hours, and sometimes there was so much ground to cover in such a little amount of time they would have to run for days without a chance to even sleep. People commonly think that the North as a whole didn't want slavery, and the South did, but this isn't true. People in the North got their clothes from the cotton plantations the Southern slaves picked, but only few were willing to stand up for what was right. There were people both in the North and South who were anti-slavery, and vice versa. When it came to North versus South, the South had plantations, so they decided to fight for slavery. But when it came to the Civil War, it was down to who was going to fight for who, which is why the common misconception is that there were only abolitionists in the North. Eventually, slaves increased by the thousands, and they were being freed from their treacherous pasts and being able to live in the America everyone else was allowed to love. Our topic, the Underground Railroad, really relates to this year's NHD theme, Breaking Barriers, because it truly shows the immense pressure and painstaking circumstances the slaves had to face. Slaves had to take long journeys through the entire United States just to gain the natural human rights that only decades earlier founding fathers and colonists longed for.
Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd. The old man's waiting there to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. When the sun goes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The old man's waiting to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. That old man's waiting there to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. The riverbed makes a mighty fine road. Dead trees show you the way. It's left foot, peg foot, traveling on. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow that drinking gourd. The old man's waiting there to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. The river ends between two hills. Follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow that drinking gourd. The old man's waiting to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.